The Vanished Farmer. Introductory opening. There's a place in Kansas, nestled away from the prying eyes of the world, where the fields stretch endlessly under a boundless sky. It's a simple town, a quiet town almost like a place untouched by time. The seasons come and go, painting the fields golden in the summer and barren in the chill of winter. But amid the rows and rows of corn, there lies a mystery that has haunted this town for over half a century. It's the story of the farmer who simply vanished one autumn evening. And to this day, under the light of the harvest moon, some say he still walks those rows, lost, forever bound to his field. Story. Old Man Turner was the kind of farmer who lived for his land. He rose before the sun, his days filled with the creak of tractor wheels, the scent of freshly turned soil, and the endless rows of corn that stretched to the horizon. He was known to everyone in town, a widower, a hard worker, and a man of few words. For years, he tended his fields with a reverence that bordered on devotion. The corn was his family, his legacy, his entire life. But one fateful night, everything changed. It was October of 1953, just as the harvest season began. The days were getting shorter, and the nights had that crisp, chilly edge that foretells winter's approach. Turner had told the neighbors he'd be out late that evening, finishing up some repairs on the old corn harvester. When the sun dipped below the horizon and a cold wind swept over the fields, he grabbed his lantern, tools, and thermos of coffee, and headed out. The evening passed without much worry. Turner's farmhouse sat empty, but that wasn't unusual. He often worked late, and everyone knew he had enough supplies to keep him going for hours. But as midnight crept closer, some townsfolk noticed something peculiar. From their windows, people could see the faint glow of his lantern bobbing deep in the field, appearing and disappearing between the rows, almost as if it was moving further and further away. By the time dawn broke, the lantern had vanished. When the sun rose the next morning, and there was still no sign of Turner, his nearest neighbors grew concerned. A group of them gathered and went out to search the cornfield, calling his name. They found his tractor parked at the edge of the field, right where he'd left it, and his thermos lying on the ground beside it, untouched. His tools were scattered nearby, as if he'd dropped them in a hurry. But of Turner himself, there was no sign. The sheriff was called, and soon the entire town was combing the cornfield, each row meticulously searched. They found no tracks, no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. All they found was his lantern, flickering faintly in the early morning light, perched atop a mound of earth in the middle of the field. But when they lifted the lantern, they discovered a strange mark carved into the soil, a twisted symbol that no one could recognize. Days turned to weeks, and Old Man Turner was officially declared missing. His land was left to grow wild, the cornfield standing as a silent memorial. But soon, rumors began to spread. People swore they'd seen strange lights dancing in the fields at night. Some claimed to hear the faint sound of footsteps crunching over the soil when the wind blew just right, as if Turner himself were still wandering the rows, lost and searching. One dark autumn evening, a pair of teenagers dared each other to spend the night in Turner's field. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of whiskey, they ventured into the corn, laughing and dismissing the old tales as mere ghost stories. But as they reached the center of the field, the air grew still, and a dense fog settled around them. They turned to leave, but as they did, one of them spotted a figure in the distance, a tall, thin man with a lantern, walking slowly through the rows. He moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, his head tilted at an odd angle, as if searching for something. They ran, abandoning their flashlight in the rush to escape, and never spoke of it again. But the story spread, and with it came more tales. Travelers passing through claimed to have seen a strange figure out in the fields, his silhouette visible in the glow of the harvest moon. And if you ventured too close, they said, you might hear his voice, faint and sorrowful, whispering in the night, calling out for help, or perhaps, for company. Years passed, and Turner's farm remained untouched, as if the land itself was unwilling to let go of him. By the time the town was ready to sell the property, the fields were overgrown, a tangled maze of corn that seemed to have a mind of its own. The new owners tried to clear it, but no matter how many times they harvested, the corn grew back thicker, almost as if it were protecting something or someone. Now, on cold October nights, locals warn visitors to stay away from that field. If you see a light out there, they say, don't go looking for it. And if you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. Old man Turner doesn't want to be disturbed. Some still wonder what happened to him. Was he pulled into another world, lost forever among the rows of his own creation? Did he find something or perhaps someone in that field, something beyond human comprehension? One thing is certain, whatever secrets lie hidden in that cornfield, they belong to old man Turner now, and no one dares to claim them. And so, the mystery of the vanished farmer lives on, a whispered warning passed down through generations. Because once you enter that field, there's no telling who or what you might meet. The next story I tell takes us into another eerie cornfield. This time, the mystery doesn't involve a missing person or ghostly children, but something stranger, something that left the entire town baffled and grasping for answers. They say that sometimes, the land itself remembers things, holding on to the marks of what can't be explained. This is the story of the unexplained crop circles and the bizarre events that began after their appearance. The unexplained crop circles. It was the summer of 1987, a time when the town of Cressyville was bustling with activity. Families were getting ready for the county fair, kids were running through the fields, and everyone seemed to have their eyes on the rich corn crops that stretched for miles in every direction. Farmers were counting their blessings, already anticipating one of the best harvests in years. But then, on an otherwise unremarkable July morning, something changed. It began with old Tom Weaver, one of the most experienced farmers in town. He was up at dawn, as always, and had just stepped outside with his coffee when he noticed something unusual in the distance. There, right in the middle of his perfectly planted field, lay a series of strange shapes etched into the corn. Circles, triangles, and odd spiral patterns that didn't seem to make any sense. They were enormous, stretching nearly the entire length of his field. Tom stood there, scratching his head, wondering who would have gone to all the trouble to trample his corn. As the sun rose higher, word spread. Curious townsfolk gathered, murmuring and whispering as they walked among the patterns. The corn stalks weren't simply trampled, they were bent with such precision, each stalk laid down at a perfect angle. No one could make sense of it. The sheriff was called in, and he brought along a few deputies to rope off the area, but that didn't stop rumors from flying. Some folks said it was the work of pranksters, others claimed it had to be something more, something otherworldly. In the days that followed, the mystery only deepened. Several other farmers woke to find similar patterns in their fields, always in the dead of night, always in the same precise, intricate designs. Each time, the patterns appeared in complete silence, with no footprints, no tracks, and no sign of anyone nearby. The townsfolk became restless. They began to swap stories over coffee at the diner, each tale stranger than the last. Mrs. Henderson claimed she saw lights flickering above the fields late at night, lights that hovered, moving in ways that defied explanation. Some said they heard an odd hum, low and constant, that seemed to vibrate through the earth. And then there was Eddie, the town's self-appointed paranormal expert, who swore he captured strange signals on his old radio when he tuned in near the fields. A week after the circles first appeared, things took a darker turn. Farmers reported strange incidents: tools going missing, barn doors swinging open in the middle of the night, animals behaving strangely. Cattle would refuse to enter the fields, and dogs would stand at the edge of the corn, barking at something no one else could see. Even the bravest men began to feel uneasy, glancing over their shoulders when they were out in the fields alone, as if they were being watched. Then came the nightmares. Tom Weaver was the first to mention them. One morning, looking pale and shaken, he confided in his wife that he had a dream, a nightmare about the crop circles. In it, he wandered through his field at night, only to find himself lost, with the corn growing taller and thicker around him. Strange, glowing figures emerged from the dark, watching him with eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. He tried to scream, but no sound would come. He woke drenched in sweat, the echo of his own silent scream still fresh in his mind. Soon, others began to have similar dreams. Different people, different details, but always the same sense of dread, the same feeling of being surrounded, watched. Some townsfolk grew so disturbed they refused to go near the fields at all. They stopped planting, stopped tending, and let the corn grow wild, untouched and undisturbed. As summer wore on, people from neighboring towns began to hear of Cresaville's cursed fields. Paranormal investigators, news crews, and UFO enthusiasts flocked to the town, hoping to catch a glimpse of the circles or find proof of the unexplained. They came with cameras, microphones, and notebooks, interviewing locals and snapping photos of the eerie symbols etched into the corn. But despite their best efforts, no one could solve the mystery. The circles remained, mocking anyone who tried to explain them. In the end, the crop circles slowly faded with the season. The corn turned brown and brittle in the fall, the patterns blending back into the earth. By the time winter came, the fields lay empty and quiet, covered in a shroud of snow that seemed to erase every trace of what had happened. Some say that the circles were a message, a warning from something far beyond our understanding. Others believe they were a passage, a doorway that opened just long enough to let someone through. But one thing is certain, those who saw the circles, who felt their strange energy, were never the same. And to this day, the people of Cresaville keep a wary eye on the cornfields each summer, half expecting to see the strange shapes return, to feel that cold shiver down their spines once more. After all, some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, their secrets buried deep in the land, waiting for the right moment to remind us that we may not be alone. So, next time you find yourself near a field of corn under a quiet summer night, take a look around. Listen to the wind, look at the sky. And if you see strange shapes in the stalks, think twice before stepping too close. Some things are better left undisturbed. The story I'm about to tell you has haunted the small town of Millfield for years. It's the kind of tale that no one can quite explain, yet everyone knows well. It's about the children of Millfield who disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. I hope you're comfortable, because this one will chill you to the bone. The Disappearing Children of Millfield. Millfield was a quaint, sleepy town nestled in the heart of a valley, surrounded by dense woodlands and miles upon miles of cornfields. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved slowly, in tune with the seasons. Most of the families who lived there had been there for generations, working the land, going to the same small school, attending church every Sunday. It was a place untouched by the rush of the outside world. One autumn, something changed. It began innocently enough. A group of local children, 8 in total, would gather every day after school at the edge of the town's largest cornfield. They called themselves the Millfield Rangers, a little club they formed to explore the woods and the cornfields that surrounded their town. Each afternoon, they disappear into the field, laughing and chasing one another through the narrow paths between the stalks. Their parents didn't mind. The town was safe, and children often wandered in the cornfields. The fields had their own magic, their endless rows forming what seemed like a natural maze where kids could lose themselves in play. But one October evening, when the sun was dipping below the hills and the air turned chilly, something went terribly wrong. The children hadn't come back. When dinner time arrived, parents started to worry. Some thought they'd simply lost track of time, but as dusk settled into darkness, concern grew into panic. A search party was quickly formed, with dozens of townspeople bringing lanterns, flashlights, and calling out the names of the missing children. Their voices echoed through the fields, but there was no reply. As the hours passed, dread settled over the town. The searchers combed through the corn, row by row, shouting until their voices went hoarse. By dawn, they had found nothing, not a single footprint, not a torn piece of clothing, nothing. It was as if the children had vanished into thin air. The following day, the town was gripped by fear and confusion. Some blamed wolves or other predators, though there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no remains. Others whispered about something darker, something unnatural. Tales of the corn spirits, ancient beings said to live among the stalks, began to surface. Millfield had a rich history of folklore, and some of the older townsfolk recalled stories their grandparents had told them, stories of spirits that protected the fields, spirits that didn't take kindly to outsiders disturbing their realm. Days passed, and despite the continued efforts, there was no sign of the children. The local authorities were at a loss. They brought in search dogs, who sniffed through the fields and woods, but even the dogs seemed confused, unable to pick up a scent. Then, a week after the children had vanished, something strange happened. One morning, Old Man Barrows, the town's unofficial historian, found a small item at the edge of the field near his property. It was a tiny shoe, worn and scuffed, unmistakably belonging to one of the children. It lay there as if placed deliberately, but no one had seen it the day before. Townsfolk gathered around, examining the shoe, their hearts sinking as they recognized it. More unsettling, there were no footprints around it. It was as if the shoe had been dropped from the sky. After that, the shoes and small belongings began appearing every few days, a mitten here, a torn ribbon there, a baseball cap that had belonged to one of the boys. Each item was found just at the edge of the cornfield, as though the children were trying to leave a trail. Some parents clung to the hope that these were signs their children were still alive, but others were haunted by a darker thought, perhaps something in the fields was playing a cruel game. Weeks turned into months. The air grew colder, and winter settled in, blanketing the fields in snow. The search parties disbanded, and a quiet grief fell over Millfield. The townsfolk still spoke of the missing children in hushed tones, as though saying their names too loudly might stir whatever force had taken them. But in the dead of winter, just as hope was beginning to fade, a new lead emerged. One of the townsfolk, a man named John Harkins, had been visiting his sister in the neighboring town. During the visit, he overheard a peculiar story. A farmer in the area claimed to have seen strange lights over the cornfields on the night the children vanished, glowing orbs that hovered over the fields, flickering like lanterns. The farmer said the lights moved in a pattern, forming circles and shapes that he'd never seen before. Harkins shared the story with the townsfolk, and suddenly, the tales of corn spirits and ancient curses resurfaced with new vigor. Some of the townsfolk, spurred by the story, began conducting nightly vigils at the edge of the fields, hoping to see the mysterious lights. They stayed up for hours, bundled in heavy coats, scanning the dark horizon. But no lights appeared, and slowly, people stopped coming. Eventually, even the most hopeful parents stopped believing they'd see their children again. Then, one night in early spring, when the ground had just begun to thaw, something strange happened. A young boy named Billy, one of the youngest in town and the brother of one of the vanished children, claimed to hear laughter coming from the cornfield. He was out walking near the edge of the field when he heard it, a soft, playful giggle that sent shivers down his spine. Billy ran back to his house, pale and shaking, telling his parents he'd heard his sister's voice. The boy was insistent, his fear so real that the parents began to believe he wasn't making it up. They gathered a group and ventured into the field that night, lanterns held high, calling out the names of the missing children. For a moment, they thought they could hear faint whispers, but just as quickly as they began, the whispers faded into silence. Spring passed into summer, and life in Millfield carried on, though the memory of the lost children haunted every corner of the town. Then, as the anniversary of their disappearance approached, something inexplicable happened. One warm evening, as the sun was setting, the townsfolk noticed strange shapes in the cornfield. From a distance, they looked like children, silhouetted by the golden light, standing motionless among the rows of corn. The townspeople froze, barely daring to breathe, afraid that any movement would make the figures disappear. The parents of the missing children rushed forward, calling out names, sobbing and pleading. But as they got closer, they realized the figures were not children, they were scarecrows, crude and twisted, clothed in old, tattered garments that looked oddly familiar. Some wore hats, others shoes, and as the parents drew near, they recognized these items. They were the clothes of their lost children. It was the final blow for Millfield. After that night, no one dared venture into the fields. The corn grew tall and wild, untouched. People moved away, unable to bear the memories. The town itself withered, the shops closed, and the streets grew empty. By the time a decade had passed, Millfield had become little more than a ghost town, a place where no one lived and only stories remained. To this day, the cornfields stand untouched, the scarecrows rotting in the rows. On certain nights, when the wind whistles through the fields, some say you can still hear the laughter of the children echoing through the valley. They say that the children never truly left, they simply became part of the land, bound to the fields for eternity. So if you ever find yourself near Millfield and see a lone figure in the distance, pause before you step closer. Listen carefully. Because you might just hear the laughter of the children who once played there and were never seen again. This next story comes from the heart of Iowa, where locals have told of a figure that haunts the open fields and dirt roads late at night. It's known as the shadow figure, a dark, looming presence that seems to appear without warning, leaving those who encounter it chilled to their core. Let us go back to where it all began. The shadow figure of Iowa. The first documented sightings of the shadow figure began decades ago, when a farmer named Henry Mills reported a strange encounter one dark, foggy night. Henry had been out late tending to his land, making sure his animals were fed and his tools put away before the coming rain. As he was about to head inside, he noticed an unusual shape standing still at the far edge of his cornfield, outlined against the dim moonlight. He couldn't make out much, just that it was tall and unnervingly still. Thinking it was a trick of the light, he turned away only to find the figure now much closer, barely 30 feet away, watching him. Henry felt an icy chill run down his spine. He couldn't see a face, but the shadowy outline gave him the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Heart pounding, he forced himself to look away, quickly closing the door behind him. That night, he barely slept, convinced the figure was still outside his house. When he checked the next morning, there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. He told himself it had been a hallucination, the result of exhaustion and shadows playing tricks. But Henry wasn't the last to see the shadow figure. Word of his story spread quickly, and over the next few months, others in the area reported similar encounters. People would glimpse a shadowy figure at the edge of the fields or standing along the dirt roads late at night, sometimes directly in their headlights, only for it to vanish the moment they blinked. Each time, it would appear closer than the last, and each time, people described the same eerie stillness and sense of dread. One winter night, a young woman named Sarah was driving down an empty country road on her way home from a friend's house. The snowfall had thickened, turning the road into a narrow path bordered by high drifts and blanketed fields. Her headlights barely cut through the snow and fog, and she was tense, focused on keeping her car steady. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Sarah saw something tall and dark standing on the side of the road, just beyond her headlight's reach. She assumed it was a broken tree or maybe a fence post, but as she drove closer, she realized it was moving. The figure wasn't just standing still this time, it was slowly walking, with long, deliberate strides, toward the center of the road. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination or a trick of the lights. But as she passed, she stole a glance in her rearview mirror, and the figure was still there, standing right in the middle of the road, staring directly at her car. It was so close now she could make out its shape clearly, though it had no discernible features. Just a black, humanoid silhouette, towering and motionless. Fighting a wave of fear, Sarah hit the gas, speeding down the road and not daring to look back again. She didn't tell anyone at first, afraid they'd think she was seeing things. But the more she thought about it, the more she felt compelled to share, and soon she learned she wasn't alone. Her story mirrored the accounts of Henry and others in the area. Throughout the following spring, sightings of the shadow figure increased, always following a similar pattern. It would stand, dark and silent, near fields or along isolated roads, disappearing when people tried to focus on it. One evening, an older couple reported seeing it from their farmhouse window, watching from the very edge of their yard. They described feeling paralyzed, as though it was draining the warmth from the room itself. They sat frozen, staring back, until it simply faded into the night. Locals began to fear that seeing the shadow figure was an omen of misfortune. Soon after her encounter, Sarah experienced a series of accidents and inexplicable misfortunes that she couldn't shake off. The Mills family, too, claimed that every sighting was followed by livestock going missing or falling ill. No one could explain the connection, but the fear and anxiety grew. One fateful summer evening, a small group of locals decided to confront the figure. Armed with flashlights and walking sticks, they gathered at the edge of the largest cornfield, where it was said to appear most frequently. They waited as the sun dipped below the horizon, the field around them turning dark and silent. For hours, they huddled together, tense and quiet, the only sound their own nervous breathing. Then, just past midnight, it appeared. They saw it out in the field, standing between the rows of corn, barely visible but undeniably there, a tall, black shape against the pale light of the moon. Heart racing, the group stepped forward, shining their flashlights. But as the beams fell on it, the figure didn't vanish. Instead, it seemed to grow taller, its shadow stretching unnaturally high. Panic set in as the air grew frigid. One by one, the flashlights started to flicker and die, as if their batteries had drained in seconds. The group stood paralyzed, trapped in place as the shadow figure seemed to loom closer, its presence filling the field with an oppressive darkness. Then, without warning, it was gone. They stumbled back to town, shaken and terrified, swearing never to speak of that night. Since then, the sightings have continued, though the shadow figure is now seen less often, as if it's retreated deeper into the fields. But the legend remains. Those who grew up in the area will tell you to avoid the cornfields and dirt roads after dark. They say that once you see the shadow figure, it never truly leaves you. It's always there, somewhere in the corner of your eye, just waiting for you to look back. So if you ever find yourself driving down a deserted road in the heart of Iowa, keep your eyes straight ahead. Don't look to the fields, don't stop, and don't glance over your shoulder. Because you never know, you might just catch a glimpse of the shadow figure, waiting there in the darkness. Our final story tonight is about a place that vanished from the map but lives on in whispered tales and campfire stories: the lost town of Decker's Field. Imagine a small, thriving farming community, tucked away in the countryside, and then imagine that one day, the entire town simply vanished, leaving behind only the haunting echo of its people's voices. This is the story of Decker's Field. The lost town of Decker's Field. In the early 1900s, Decker's Field was a quiet farming community nestled between miles of cornfields and dense forest. The townsfolk were close-knit, a mix of families who had lived there for generations and new settlers drawn by the promise of fertile land. The town itself was small, with a few shops lining Main Street, a modest church, and a handful of homes. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and every harvest season, the town would celebrate with a large festival that drew people from neighboring areas. But in the summer of 1913, something strange happened. Stories spread about eerie lights glowing over the cornfields late at night, shifting shapes barely visible in the early morning mist, and an unsettling quiet that settled over the town as dusk fell. The townsfolk tried to brush it off, chalking it up to tall tales or mischief. But as the days went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, the local blacksmith, Joseph Lorne, claimed he'd seen strange figures standing in the cornfields. He described them as tall, thin shadows with long, bony arms that seemed to blend in with the corn. Others laughed at first, dismissing it as a trick of the light. But Joseph wasn't the only one. Soon, more and more people reported sightings of these shadowy figures, always lingering at the edges of the fields, just far enough to be indistinct yet close enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. Then, as suddenly as the sightings began, the people of Decker's field vanished. It was a traveling salesman named Arthur Clegg who made the discovery. He'd been passing through the area, planning to stay overnight in Decker's field, as he'd done many times before. But when he arrived, the town was empty. Not a single soul was there. Shops were left unlocked, the market stall stands were half-stocked, and dinner tables sat with plates and cups still in place, as though the residents had been there only moments before. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that people had packed up and left. It was as if they had all simply walked away in the middle of their daily lives, leaving everything behind. Confused, Arthur walked from house to house, calling out, hoping to find anyone. But the only sounds were the wind rustling through the cornfields and the distant creak of an old weather vane turning. Feeling uneasy, he decided to leave and report the town's strange disappearance to the nearby sheriff's office. But before he could leave, he caught something out of the corner of his eye, a shadowy figure, standing at the edge of the cornfield, watching him. Arthur froze, his heart pounding as he watched the figure. It didn't move or make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, Arthur forced himself to turn back toward his car. But when he looked again, the figure was closer, standing only a few yards away. Not daring to wait any longer, he bolted, his heart racing as he sped away from Decker's field. When he returned with authorities the next day, the town was just as he had left it, empty, eerily silent, as though it had been abandoned for years. Over the years, a few brave souls have ventured back to Decker's field, hoping to find answers. Those who return tell of strange occurrences, the air filled with whispering voices, flickering lights hovering over the fields, and, sometimes, shadowy figures standing at the edge of the town, watching silently. Some even claim to have seen ghostly apparitions of the townsfolk, frozen in place, as if caught in a moment just before they disappeared. They speak of phantom lights that appear over the cornfields, casting an unnatural glow over the ruins of the old town. One particularly chilling account comes from a local historian, Harold Baker, who went in search of Decker's field in the 1970s. He described hearing faint voices as he approached the town's remnants, though no one was around. As he reached what had once been Main Street, he saw a group of shadowy figures at the far end, standing perfectly still. They appeared to be watching him, as if expecting him, though he couldn't make out any faces. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something unnatural lingered in the air. He left, convinced that whatever haunted Decker's field was more than just memory. As time passed, Decker's field faded from most maps, becoming little more than a legend passed down through generations. But the stories remain stories of ghostly figures standing in the cornfields, of eerie lights that appear and disappear in the dead of night, and of the whispering voices of the townsfolk who vanished without a trace. Locals will tell you that Decker's field is cursed, a place where time has stopped, and that those who enter may never return. So if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely road and see an empty town at the edge of a cornfield, keep driving. Because you never know, you might just stumble upon the lost town of Decker's field. And if you do, beware of the figures standing silently among the cornstalks. They might be waiting for you to join them.